Well, good evening and welcome to the Commemorative Air Force Warbird Tube webinar for this evening. I'm your host, Steve Buss, and we're glad that you can join us tonight. This webinar series is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force, and you can support the CAF through membership or donations. For details on how you can further the CAF's mission to educate, inspire, and honor, please visit our website at commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you listen to tonight's presentation, some questions may come to mind. If you have a question, just type it in the chat box and we'll save time at the end to answer those questions. So joining me from her home in Maryland is Erin Miller, granddaughter of WASP Elaine Harmon and author of the book, Final Flight, Final Fight. Erin, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody.
Well, you have a very interesting story, not only personally with yourself, but also with your grandmother, who was one of the original women Air Force service pilots. And let's talk a little bit about her.
Okay. My grandmother was Elaine Danforth Harmon. She was born in 1919 at home in Baltimore, Maryland, down the street from the old, what used to be the Memorial Stadium. If anybody is familiar with Baltimore, that was the neighborhood she grew up in. And she attended University of Maryland for college.
What was it that made her think about becoming a WASP?
Well, my grandmother learned to fly while she was attending the University of Maryland in her last year of school. There was an advertisement in the school newspaper for the civilian pilot training program class to learn how to fly. So in the 1930s, there was a program run by the US government to increase the number of people that, would have pilot's licenses in, I think, advanced hope that we would be more prepared if we had to join World War II and have pilots involved. So there were programs attached to multiple universities across the country, and one of them was University of Maryland. Another one was Tuskegee University. So if you know, some of the Tuskegee Airmen participated in that program. And anyway, so my grandmother learned to fly in her last year during that program, which cost $40 to learn how to fly for the whole program. And my grandmother's mother did not know about it because she was very against women doing unladylike things like flying planes. So my grandmother didn't tell her own mom about this. She asked her dad for permission and got the money from him, and he had to sign a permission slip, even though she was a senior at university, because she wasn't married and she was under the age of 21. So she got her dad's permission to fly in this program, and that's where she got her license. And that was in 1940. And then she got married in the summer of 1941. And then obviously later that year, Pearl Harbor happened. And then the WASP program initially was two separate programs, but eventually my grandmother joined in 1944. So she hadn't really flown in between the time she learned and the time she joined the Women Air Force Service Pilots. But she had heard about them, and her husband actually encouraged her to join because she was a little bit unsure if she would qualify because she only had the minimum hours and her license. And she, for some reason, had it in her head that all the other women applying would be super expert airplane pilots, even though there were a lot of them just like her who had just learned to fly in the civilian pilot training program and basically had, mostly the minimum hours. It's not like they were all, well experienced pilots or anything. So yeah, she applied and got in. And my grandfather was not in the military. He had a health issue, so he couldn't serve in the Army, but he was a civilian and later was an attorney. He was an engineer. So he went overseas to Asia and worked there during the war to assist with aviation management of repair of airplanes overseas. So he was not in the United States while she was doing this program, ironically.
And her mother still did not approve of her being a WASP either,
Yes.
even after being accepted.
Once my grandmother found out she got accepted, obviously she couldn't disappear for a while without her parents noticing. So she told them she got in this program. And according to my grandmother, her mother did not speak to her the entire time she was serving with the WASP. And when she came home, my great grandmother basically pretended like nothing had happened and never talked about it.
It's very interesting times. And being a WASP, I'm sure even at the time she didn't realize that she was kind of a groundbreaking person. There are just over 1,000 women who were accepted into the WASP program, and they really did lay the foundation for what women in aviation experience now. But it was kind of tough being in Sweetwater, Texas, where they did all their training. It's kind of hot and dusty, and it's not the most accommodating place in the world.
Right. Well, originally the program was in Houston, Texas, which apparently is not very accommodating either because it's very foggy. So apparently they thought it would be better in West Texas where it's, at least drier, even though it's very windy. And unlike today, the WASP were all together. It was all women together. So that's unusual. We don't really have that anymore, where you have a female only situation. And one of the things my grandma talked about a lot is all these good friends that she made in training. And then later on, when they were, doing talks and things, and she would meet the ones that were in different classes that she didn't know, she felt like they were all her friends. And, they had all a similar experience. So they had like this close relationship, even the ones that hadn't, been together during the war.
It's interesting, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing a number of the original WASP through the years, and they all seem to have the same sort of personality. Very, I hate to use the word spunky, but that's kind of what comes to mind. But also very energetic, very enthusiastic, and anytime you say anything about airplanes, they just light up and just love to talk aviation.
Yes, my grandmother, definitely a very energetic person, very independent. Growing up, she did a lot of activities and sports. At university, she was the vice president of a sorority. She was a cheerleader. She was on the rifle team. She did swimming and diving, all kinds of different athletics things. And she was, good at school too. And basically the reason she took the civilian pilot training course is because she was bored and she thought flying looked interesting. So unlike a lot of the WASP who, when you talk to them, say things like, I grew up near an airport and I saw planes overhead and it was really interesting to me since I was a little child. My grandmother really started flying because she was bored and looking for something interesting to do. But once she started doing it, she really fell in love with it. And I think especially during the WASP program, enjoyed learning to fly the different planes and being around all these other women that were kind of her same personality, like willing to go out and do this kind of unusual thing for the time and flying planes and being away from home. And, a lot of women at that time didn't even drive cars. So I think she kind of found her people. So.
There you go. Well, she earned her wings, and what were the different aircraft that she flew?
So during training, they basically flew the PT-19s, the Stearmans, your basic training planes, BT-13s, AT-10s. They learned every plane, but obviously every person didn't learn every single plane. But those were the main training planes that they worked on, which I'm sure commemorative Air Force people are very aware of, T-6s, things like that. And then when my grandmother went to, after training, she was assigned to Nellis, what's today Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her job was to train men on instrument training in the BT-13. So they took it up in the air and the men in the back seat would have the canvas over the canopy so they couldn't see outside, and they were just learning. I'm sure these people already knew how to fly. They're practicing flying with their instruments. My grandmother described her job as making sure the men didn't fly the plane into Mount Charleston. But she was transferred there with her best friend from training, Maggie G, and Maggie G was a tow target pilot. So.
Yeah. Now, in reading the book, I don't remember if it was your grandmother who said it or one of the other WASP that they encountered some resistance from the male pilots until the guys figured out that these ladies really could fly and did know their stuff and were oftentimes better at it than they were.
Yes. So my grandmother was a very modest person and not the type to like talk poorly of other people. So trying to get these type of stories out of her was very difficult. She would always say things like, "Oh, well, the men were hesitant at first, but once they realized we could fly, they were fine." Which, of course, you talk to some other WASP and they had some pretty difficult experiences, at times with some commanders not even letting them fly planes or forcing them to fly broken planes or things like that. And my grandma just glossed over all of that. I don't know if it's because she didn't really experience anything, which is possible, or she just didn't really want to talk about it. But she was very generic about it. Like, yeah, it was fine. They were a little bit, hesitant, but then it was fine. Like, okay, grandma, well, that's not a very, dramatic story.
Well, and you mentioned her friend, Margaret. We got a
Maggie
picture of her
G.
here.
Yeah,
Man,
Maggie
yeah.
G.
In the book, it's something that I guess I knew just from the history of the WASP, but there were no women of color in the WASP program. But Maggie was one of two Oriental descendants that were in the program.
Right. So there were two Chinese American women, Maggie G and Hazel Ying Lee. Hazel Ying was actually one of the 38 WASP that died during service. And Maggie G was from a very close-knit family in Berkeley, California. Her community was very much a Chinese immigrant community. And she and my grandmother became very friendly during WASP training. And Maggie, I talked with Maggie later on, when I was growing up, and just, she was my grandma's friend. But they were very opposite politically and in a lot of other ways, but they were very good friends. And, Maggie's from Berkeley. She was a scientist and a physics, I think she had a PhD in physics or something, and very intelligent. And I remember her house had books all over the place. And, my grandma was intelligent too, but they were very, very different politically. And I would ask my grandma, how are you two friends? This is so weird. And she's like, we just don't talk about politics or religion. I'm like, okay.
There you go.
But yeah, and Maggie, would say things like, I didn't really see a lot of white people until I went to the WASP program, because my family, kept us in our little community and we really stayed very within our community. And so I didn't go out and about a lot until I went to this program and got to meet all these people from all over the country with all different backgrounds, from cities or from farms. And it was very interesting to listen to her perspective, because my grandma was from a big city, Baltimore. She was used to being around a lot of different people.
Very, very different perspectives on the country, and also from the opposite ends of the country, one on the West Coast and
Right.
on the East Coast. And you mentioned that your grandmother was no slouch either. Her degree was in bacteriology.
I believe it was bacteriology, at least that's what she told us, but I've seen it listed as other ways. Anyway, some kind of science-oriented thing having to do with, but during the war, but before she joined the WASP, she worked in Ohio at an Army serology laboratory, like testing blood and stuff.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Of course, the WASP made Fifinella their mascot with
Right.
blessings from Walt Disney, and we see Fifinella continue to pop up in association with the WASP even today.
Yes, she's a very cute little character that I think they I don't know, my grandma thought she was cute and liked to have Fifinella. My grandma had a little tote bag with the Fifinella logo on it that she carried everywhere. The Fifinella comes from the Roald Dahl book about the gremlins, the little creatures that supposedly, infect airplanes or whatever. But she was the girl one. So Walt Disney designed her, and they let the WASP use her as their mascot logo, whatever you want to call it. And you can see it on their jackets and things. It's kind of.
Now, when the program ended, it was a rather abrupt ending for the WASP program, and again, politics and some discrimination kind of led to this unceremonious end to the program.
Right. So during World War II, a lot of female groups and other groups were being created to become part of the armed forces, and each one required its own legislation in Congress to officially, appropriate it, authorize it. So all these different bills were passing through Congress to create all these different groups, and one of them was the Women Air Force Service Pilots, because as I mentioned before, it was actually started as two different groups, the Women's Flying Training Detachment and the Women's Auxiliary Flying Squadron, which was a ferrying group, and then Jackie Cochran wanted to start a particular training group. So you had these two kind of similar ideas going on at the same time that merged eventually to become the WASP. And during this whole process, the Army was debating, should these become officially part of our program? And there was a bill in Congress to make them officially part of the military. It failed by 19 votes in the summer of 1944 because of many factors, but probably the two main reasons being there were a lot of men lobbying against the bill, and the war had also taken D-Day had happened, and so there was a little bit more, I think, optimism about, okay, we're going to win. We don't need all these extra people now, so this isn't as important as it was 2 years ago. So the bill failed, and at the end of 1944, the program was officially canceled, and they sent everybody home. And they were never officially, at that time, recognized as having served with the Army or veterans or anything like that. The 38 who died were not recognized as having died in service. At the time, they were recognized as being civilians, even though when they joined, they were under the impression they were joining the Army. They flew Army planes, all that.
And this will come back later on in your grandmother's life as the WASP worked to gain veterans status in the 1970s. But after the program ended, what did your grandmother do?
Well, immediately when it ended, she went back to Baltimore, where, like I said, her mom pretended like nothing had ever happened. And even her other relatives, my grandma told me, nobody was really interested in what she had been doing, which is obviously very much in contrast to today. People think they're so interesting. And she said she was bored because her husband was still overseas and she didn't have anything to do. So she moved to California for, I think, about a year, and eventually worked at Oakland Airport as an air traffic controller. And she stayed with a family there, like in one of the rooms in a house with a family with kids. And she took the bus to work, and I think it cost 10 cents or something. And I remember when she first got there, she didn't have any money, and the family gave her free lunch, like a bag lunch to take to work every day. And then at some point, my grandfather wired her money, and she was like, "I'm rich now." So, because she was waiting for her first paycheck. And then once my grandfather came home from Asia, they moved back to Maryland and started a family. And they had 4 children. And my grandfather died in the 1960s. So I never met him. And so my grandmother had these 4 children to raise by herself. And she didn't really fly again because she had lots of kids to take care of, and it's expensive and things like that.
And also, even at that time in the 60s, it was the opportunities for women to fly in airlines, let alone the military, were just not even a possibility.
Right. And if you talk to some of the other WASP who did either stay in aviation or try to stay in aviation, because there definitely were a lot of them who stuck with it and were very determined to stay in that career path. They had a really hard time getting jobs in aviation. I think B. Haydu said she wrote to every single aviation company in the country, and only one of them wrote back. So that's the one she ended up working for. And eventually she owned her own plane sales business and things like that. But she stayed in that for a long time. And a few of them, a lot of them were able to figure that out. And Marty Weil, another of the WASP, told me that who she had trained her husband how to fly. she said he saw an advertisement for a pilot position for one of the commercial airlines, probably in the 60s. And he was like, you should apply for that. You have so much experience. And she's like, they're not going to take me. And he's like, okay, but I think you're so great. And she's like, look, we'll both apply and we'll see what happens. And so they applied, and she got an offer to become a flight attendant, and he got an interview offer to become a pilot, even though she had trained him, and he like basically had like the minimum amount of hours.
Yes, strange world in which we live. But
Yes.
without aviation in her life, she took another path to help keep the bills paid and the lights on.
Yeah, so eventually she got into the real estate industry as an appraiser. She was an assistant to an appraiser for a while and then became an appraiser, which ironically she said was actually more of a boys' club than aviation. So she actually one of the few women in the real estate appraisal business at the time, I guess. So she did that for a long time as a job, which, you know, is kind of a random job, I think, but that's what she ended up doing.
And then in the 1970s, we get sort of this renewed interest in the WASP, and the WASP themselves start working toward trying to find out if they can finally get the veteran status that they were promised back in the 1940s. And your grandmother was very much a part of that movement.
Right. So in the 1970s, the government required the service academies, like the Naval Academy, to integrate women into their programs. And the Air Force was also starting to have women pilots in their programs. And they, you know, started having all these news articles about these will be the first women to fly for the military. And my grandma and her friends were like, we did that like 30 years ago. Nobody remembers us. So they kind of prompted them to go to Congress and lobby to get recognized as veterans for their service during World War II. And my grandmother lived in Silver Spring, which is the town adjacent to Washington, D.C. So her house was very close to, you know, the Capitol. And a lot of the WASP, when they came to town, they would stay at her house and hang out while they planned their lobbying missions and testimony and things like that. So I'm sure they had a good old time hanging out there at my grandma's house in the 70s. And they would go downtown, and B. Haydu was instrumental in this. Marty Weil, you know, I'm sure a lot of the WASP that you've met, because they go to, you know, they went to lots of events and things. And they would go downtown and talk to legislators, and eventually, in 1977, as part of the GI reauthorization bill, the Women Air Force Service pilots were in the law passed, allowed to apply to the Department of Defense to be recognized as veterans. And that took another 2 years. So in 1979, my grandmother received her DD-214, which shows that you have performed active duty service for the armed forces, which was 35 years after she served.
And that form and that legislation will become pivotal in your quest
Yes.
a little bit later on. But your grandmother obviously enjoyed sharing the WASP story, and that's part of the motivation for you later on to help with her final flight, as it were. But you know, growing up, she really didn't bring out the WASP story to you, at least, and really, I think you said that she really wanted her children and grandchildren to find their own path and not be necessarily influenced by what she had done.
Yes, we knew what she did. You know, she had a uniform, and by the time I was born, she already had decided, okay, I need to go out and give talks and, you know, go to schools and museums and talk about this, because we didn't talk about it for 30 years and people forgot about us. We had to go to Congress to be recognized as veterans. So she and these other ones that were very influential in getting this law passed realized, like, we have to go out and give talks about this. We can't just, you know, assume that everything's going to be fine, because we're not in books. Nobody knows what we did. So they all started going out and giving talks at the schools and museums and going to air shows like Oshkosh and all those things. And during this time, I knew what she did. It wasn't a secret. You know, I would see her get her uniform on and go talk to some school. Somehow she never came to my school. I don't know how that happened. But yes, this is what I call my little like foreshadowing lobbying shirt. I was probably, I don't know, like 5 years old. It says Gammy flew planes in World War II. And I think that is a shirt that my cousins and I all passed around, or else we had matching ones. But yeah, so we knew what she did. It wasn't like a secret, but you know, it's not like she forced us to go to all her events or anything. You know, she was very supportive of whatever we were interested in. Like, you know, I have cousins that are very artistic, and she was supportive of them, and, you know, in music or whatever, she, you know, was very supportive of whatever we were interested in. But yeah, we knew what she did, and I did go to some of her events, but it's not like she forced it on us or anything. And, you know, when I would talk about it to my friends, people had no idea what I was talking about. You know, the kids at school, like only my close friends who had met her, like knew what I was talking about. Like people thought, when I was very small, I thought everyone's grandma was one of the women Air Force service pilots. I thought that was what grandmas did. And I thought everyone's grandma was a pilot, and that was grandma's job. But when I got older, I realized not everyone's grandma was a pilot. So that was a big eye opener, you know, when I got older, which my mom thinks is really funny.
Yes, but why wouldn't you think that? I mean, there was no reason to think that everyone's
I don't know, I'm
grandmother
sure all
didn't
kids
fly.
think that. And if your parents are lawyers, you think everyone's parents are lawyers at some point in your life, and then you realize, oh, everyone has different jobs, and like it's just, you know, I didn't really put it together until I was older, because I figured everyone did something in World War II, and for some reason I thought everyone's grandma flew planes in World War II.
Makes perfect sense.
And we didn't have, like I said, they weren't in history books, and nobody really knew about them, and we didn't have Google, so kids didn't know about it. So when we talked about it, they'd be like, that's not a thing. I don't know what you're talking about. And I actually, a couple years ago in Oshkosh, I was giving a talk, and a gentleman came up to me after my talk and said that his mother was a WASP. And this gentleman's, I think, daughter, at some point when she was in school, had been called to the principal's office for lying. And when he got to school to talk to the principal about it, you know, she said, well, your daughter was saying that, you know, her grandma was flying planes in World War II. We don't really appreciate children making things up. And so he had to, like, you know, explain that that was not a lie, and it was in fact a thing. And so the principal felt really bad. And then they all, I guess, had a lecture about the WASP and what they did in World War II.
Another learning experience.
Yes.
Your grandmother lived a long life. Unfortunately, she was ill at the end, which you describe in the book, and I encourage everyone to get the book and to read it if you haven't already done so. But one of her final wishes was to be buried in Arlington, and this is where the final fight comes into this story, because the policy from the Army, which runs Arlington National Cemetery, was that the WASP did not qualify for burial in the cemetery.
Right. So going back to the law that was passed in 1977, you read it very carefully. It says this is for laws administered by the Veterans Administration. So my grandma's DD 214 has an asterisk on it that says this is applicable to veterans benefits under the laws administered by the Veterans Administration, which today is the Department of Veterans Affairs. So Arlington National Cemetery is run by the Department of the Army. The Department of Veterans Affairs runs more than 136 national military cemeteries, but not Arlington. So a month before my grandmother passed away, which was April 2015, the United States Army made a decision that the women Air Force service pilots were not eligible on their own to be at Arlington National Cemetery. We didn't know this. So after my grandmother passed away and my mother sent the paperwork in to have her laid to rest there, the cemetery called back, I don't know, like a month later, and said she wasn't allowed to be there and pointed this memo out to us. So my mother asked me to help her do some research and figure out what they were talking about. So that's when I really learned all these details, because growing up, I kind of knew the general story, but I didn't know the law numbers and all of the dates and everything. So when this started, I really learned all of the details of all of this. And I had finished law school a couple years before that. So this was right up my alley to be doing all this research, right? So I did a lot of research and I told my mom, the Army's not actually wrong. I mean, obviously I don't agree with them, but the argument that they're making isn't really wrong. And my mom was like, well, what do we do? And I was like, you know, if you really want to fix this, you have to get a law passed through Congress to force them to change this. Because even though the Army has exceptions for people at Arlington, so you all know, like, there are certain people who didn't serve that are buried there and that kind of thing or whatever. My mom felt it was really important to have my grandmother laid to rest there on her own merit as a WASP, recognized as a veteran. And having an exception for her would kind of diminish, you know, what they had worked so hard for in the 1970s to be recognized as veterans. So that's when we moved forward with trying to get this law passed to require the Army to recognize their service officially.
So what was the first step in this journey?
So first step, when I did all this research and I, you know, printed everything out, I explained it to my mom, and we sent it to Senator Barbara Mikulski, who was our United States Senator at the time, who was in an earlier picture with my grandma that you showed. And we explained it to her, we told her what was going on, and we sent the stuff to her. And a couple months later, we got a response that was about 4 sentences long that said something like, we asked the cemetery about this, you know, blah, 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 and then basically, we wish this would have been more successful or something. I forget the words they used. But very short, and basically, like, we looked into this and this is the way it is. And I was like, this is not acceptable. So then I started making posts on social media, and I started talking to my family, and we kind of all had this collective idea of making a petition or like doing, you know, public awareness campaign. So my sister, one of my sisters, under her account, created this petition on change.org. Meanwhile, I was going out and talking to reporters and trying to get people in the media interested in the story. And one of our local reporters, Andrea McCarran at Channel 9 here in Washington, D.C., took interest in the story, and she did a lot of work with veterans issues. So that's kind of why I focused on trying to get her to work on it, which fortunately she did. And we did a nice interview at the College Park Museum, which is at the airport where my grandma learned how to fly. And there's a display of her uniform and things there. And once we did that story, a lot of other news outlets found it and got interested. And we did, you know, interviews with Associated Press and CBS Nightly News and all these, you know, all these things. So that really started helping get attention to the issue. And then Representative Martha McSally's staff saw the story and pointed it out to her. And she offered to write legislation to fix the problem. So that was a really big key step in the story. And at the time, Martha was in her first term as a member of Congress from Arizona. And she had retired after serving in the Air Force for 26 years as an A-10 pilot. And Martha was actually the first woman to fly a combat mission for the United States Air Force, which happened about 50 years after the WASP were flying. So it took 50 years for a woman to fly in combat after the WASP were flying, you know, first at all. So it was kind of cool that she was in Congress and able to help us with this issue, and that she found this, because she was very passionate about it and obviously very interested in making sure that it passed. Because one of the things when I talk to people about advocacy and people who are interested in changing problems is to make sure that you have legislators, people that are really passionate about your issue, because a lot of times they will, you know, just happen to be the one in your district or whatever, and they might introduce legislation, but they don't really follow up with it, and it's kind of just hanging out there. So we were very lucky to have her there, because she was like, this is like, I'm totally into this and I want this to happen. And it was like, constant, very focused on this issue. So we were really lucky that she was there to help us with this. And then meanwhile, of course, I kept doing news stories because you have to kind of keep the issue out there. It's not like, oh, good, we got this bill introduced, now we can do nothing. It's like, now you have to do even more because you have to make sure it gets passed. Because if it doesn't get passed in that session of Congress and then a new session starts, you have to, reintroduce the bill and then start everything over again. It makes it more difficult. So we kept doing news stories and things. And then I went down to Capitol Hill very often for a few months in a row, every week, to talk to lawmakers. And I went to more than 150 offices on Capitol Hill to talk to members of the House of Representatives and senators and their staffs to make sure that they knew about this bill and they were going to vote yes on it and they were co-sponsoring it and paying attention. But it moved very quickly through the House, which I give a lot of credit to. Sorry, my dogs are barking. So I give a lot of credit to her and her staff for being very on top of this. And it moved very quickly through the House of Representatives. It took about a little over 2 months. And then it was passed unanimously through the House of Representatives. And then it went to the Senate. And it was over there for a couple months. And then it went through the Senate and they changed 2 words. So it had to get passed by the House again. And then it went to the president and, he has 10 days to sign it. So eventually he signed it and it became law. And my mom called the next business day and requested my grandmother to be buried at Arlington Cemetery. And they told her they were putting my grandma back in the line.
When you're doing all the lobbying, and I believe your sister had been a lobbyist at one time as well, so she kind of helped get you started. But as you were going and visiting all of these different offices, for the most part in the book, you're receiving very positive support from representatives and senators. But were there any that just sort of pushed back on this idea? It seems like the right thing to do, but there's always another side to the story.
For the most part, people were very supportive, which is great. But even though people are supportive, it doesn't always mean they're going to really advocate for you. They might be like, oh, yeah, but like, people were really excited about this. And I think it was a good issue because it's very bipartisan. Most people support veterans, it's women, it's World War II people, it's like women's rights. It's got all kinds of angles to it. And people generally really like the Women Air Force Service pilots as a group. So, that was exciting. I had just, basically one office in the Senate that refused to help us, but I figured so many people were helping us, it wasn't really a big deal to have one person kind of say no.
Right.
And then other people, for the most part, were even enthusiastic. Where like, I remember I went to one office and they were like, we were waiting for you to come. And I was like, you could have called me. We were hoping you would show up in our office.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But yeah, it was nice because like I said, there's a lot, there's always a lot of issues in Congress and these really big like healthcare bills and defense bills and all this stuff. And it's like, this is like a nice, simple, short problem. Like here's my grandma, her ashes are in the closet. We need to bury her. It's a World War II thing. And like, for the most part, very supportive, and like makes people look good and is a happy story. If it's passed, it's like helping this family and recognizing the veterans and things. And
in the book, you write that your grandmother was hoping that by being in Arlington and having other WASP who choose to be in Arlington, it would continue to tell the WASP story, that visitors might come across a marker that says women Air Force service pilots and want to learn more about and continue to learn about the original WASP.
Yes, exactly. So like I mentioned, after the issue in the 1970s, she spent the rest of her life giving talks and lectures at schools and museums and things. But even she realized that she's one person and she's talking to groups at a time, not to big audiences. And part of her goal of having herself laid to rest at Arlington was hopefully her gravestone that said WASP World War II. People would stop and think, oh, what's that? Let me Google that on my phone and figure out what this is and learn about them. And that was really her goal, is so she could keep educating people even after she was gone.
What were some of the emotions that you had in the time that the House bill passed and the president finally signed it? I mean, that was a long, relatively long period of time. I'm sure the anticipation must have been kind of getting to you.
Yeah, it was a weird process. I try to explain in the book. When my grandma first died, I was very sad, but she was really old. She was 95 years old, and she had been very sick with cancer. So it's not like it was a surprise, but it's so sad when you lose someone very important like that. She'd been around my whole life, and she lived down the street from me, and very close. And then once we started having this issue with Arlington, then I became angry, right? And irritated and frustrated and determined to make sure that she was recognized. So then I was very focused on getting this problem solved, and I was much less emotional. It was very practical and just mechanical. Here's what we have to do. We have to do this, and we have to get spill passed, and very focused on what do we have to achieve. But every once in a while during that time, I would have random incidents where I would just start crying randomly. Something would remind me of her or something out of the blue, and I would just randomly start crying. But most of the time I was very focused on the task at hand and very what's going to happen next? What do I need to do? I need to email these people and whatever. And then when the bill passed through the House, Representative McSally was really nice to invite me down to the floor of the House of Representatives to watch the vote in person. So that was really cool. So I was really honored by that and excited. And it's exciting to watch the bill pass, unanimously. And then it's okay, now I have to wait for the Senate. So then you're waiting. And my mom kept asking, Erin, what's going on at the Senate? And I was like, Mom, I don't know. And she's like, why aren't you making it happen faster? And I'm like, I'm not in charge of the Senate, Mom. I don't know what else to do. I'm doing everything I can. I talk to them all the time. It just, they're working on it, She'd be like, oh, they're taking too long. I'm like, okay, Mom. And then once it passed the Senate and got sent to the president, I was at work one day, and there was a tweet on my phone from, I think he was a CBS reporter, who just wrote a tweet here are some bills the president is signing today. And he's like, the president just signed the WASP Arlington bill. And I was like, oh, and so I saw this tweet at work, which seemed kind of anticlimactic given everything that had happened. But then I was really so excited. I left work early, and I was like, I have to go have a drink or something.
Well, or something, maybe a tattoo.
Yeah, so at some point during this process also, I was talking to one of my sisters, and I was really irritated about something that had happened. And I said, once this is over, I have to do something to commemorate this, And I was like, maybe I should get a tattoo. And she was like, I'm going to hold you to that. And I was like, okay. And then I kind of forgot about it. And then once it got sent to the White House, my sister was like, so when are you getting your tattoo? And I was like, oh, I can't get it until they actually are going to for sure sign this thing. So at some point before it was signed, but after it was at the White House, somebody was like, yeah, he's going to sign it. It's on the list. He just hasn't done it yet. So I was like, all right. So I went and got this tattoo, which is the bill number from the House of Representatives on my arm. So a little, I don't know, crazy, but yeah.
That's quite a way to celebrate.
Yes, big celebration.
And in the book, you kind of touch on the sort of excitement in the bill passing, but yet it's commemorating a sad occasion. And you kind of have a little discussion with yourself about being very excited that the bill passed, but yet also feeling sad that your grandmother was gone. But let's talk a little bit about the funeral itself. How long did it take from the time your mom got your grandmother back on the list until the actual funeral services?
So the bill was signed late May. I think it was May 20th. 2016. And my mom called, that was a Friday. She called the Monday after that, and they gave us a list of dates. And September 7th was one of those dates, so we picked that one. So from May to September, so the entire summer we waited, after already having waited more than a year and getting a law passed in Congress to get her there.
And
yeah.
Not only in your grandmother's cremated, so as you'd mentioned, the ashes, her remains were in the closet at the house, but through the petition, which had what, over 170,000 signatures?
Correct.
Yeah, you gained admirers and fans from all over the world, including a gentleman who created the urn that she's laid to rest in.
Yes. So this gentleman has become very friendly with my mother since this time, and they talk a lot on email. He lives in Idaho. His name is John Sword, and he does woodworking. And his business is called Everlasting Tree, and they have a website where he makes furniture and things. But one of the things he does as a hobby to serve veterans is he makes these urns of wood, and he uses different wood for different urns. And he donates them to cemeteries for people who don't have the money to purchase urns, because urns can be very expensive. And the urns that he usually creates are kind of like, there's a hole at the bottom, so you can stick the cremains come in like a plastic box from the state, and so you can put them in this urn, and then for the ceremony you can use it, for the official part, and then you can just put the plastic box in the actual niche or whatever, wherever they're laid to rest, and then you can reuse the urn for more than one funeral. So he's donated these to lots of cemeteries to honor veterans and allow their families to have like a proper vehicle to move their loved ones' cremains during the ceremony. So he's been very kind and creates lots of things like that for veterans and their families, which I thought was really cool. When it showed up, I was like, whoa, this is quite a creation. And he's got a whole story about it. It's like got waves for, it means something. And then he created another thing that has like a leaf from Arlington recreated on it. And then this urn actually has sand in it from, I want to say, Pearl Harbor and maybe one of the Normandy type beaches and maybe Sweetwater. I forget, because he's sent a couple different things with, he gets sand, he travels and collects sand and then puts them in these little slots in the bottom of the urn. And
of course, a funeral for a pilot wouldn't be complete without a flyby. And this is another aspect of people just hearing about it and wanting to be a part of the funeral. Volunteers that just said, yes, I'll fly my airplane at your grandmother's funeral.
Yes, this was a really big deal. And I was kind of talking with you earlier, and I kind of try to explain when I go to do talks at Oshkosh and air shows and things, how the aviation community really came together to support my family during this process. And I met all of these people that had known my grandmother, or at least, met the WASP or knew about them, and were really interested in honoring them and helping our family make sure that this happened. And then when the funeral was being planned, people offered to do this flyover. So we had Scott Yoke, who you guys probably know flies Quicksilver, the P-51 plane. And we had Rob Krieg, who flies a T-6, the one in the picture right there at the time, and several other pilots in their group. So we had 3 P-51s and 3 T-6s scheduled to do this flyover at my grandmother's funeral. And one of them took this really cool picture as they're flying over the Pentagon, coming into Arlington to actually do the flyover. So that was really a cool moment and something I didn't expect to happen. And it was really nice of them to offer. We actually had an offer from an Air Force unit to do a flyover with a bunch of like C-130s as well. But we were like, okay, this is a lot of planes. So that was very kind. We had a lot of people offering things, and it was so nice that it was so overwhelming we couldn't even fit everything in that people were offering. Like, that's how nice it was. I can't hear you.
In reading the book, the narrative of the funeral, you mentioned that Arlington has a number of funerals or burials every day. So you're kind of on a tight time frame. So the service itself is pretty compact. You had the flyover, but then you took time to have a memorial service, and not only to honor your grandmother's memory, but also to thank everyone who had been so supportive of helping this final fight.
Yes, I want to say Arlington does more than 30 funerals every single day. And they're very organized about it. The people who work there are very professional, and they have everything scheduled. They know exactly what to do. It becomes a little bit more difficult, I think, when there's a situation like ours that has all this attention and you have all these press people coming and hundreds of people that want to attend the funeral. Becomes a little more difficult, but they are totally very professional about it, know exactly what to do. And even though sometimes things like, oh, the flyover is now going to be at this time, they're like, okay, well, and they just figure it out. So they were very nice and scheduled and organized, which was nice. And then we had a memorial service at the Women's Military Memorial, which is next door to Arlington. And my grandmother had been friendly with General Vaught, who was basically the original person behind the idea to get the Women's Military Memorial built, a couple decades ago. So it was really fitting to have her service there. So we had a nice memorial service. And yes, the goal was not there to be all weepy and sad. It was like, we have this celebration. We honored my grandmother. We got this law passed. And all these people are here to celebrate the women Air Force service pilots and their history of finally being recognized to be at Arlington on their own merit. And we had Representative McSally came, and Senator Joni Ernst came, and one of the undersecretaries for the Air Force was there. So we had a lot of representatives from the government. We had 3 of the women Air Force service pilots, a lot of their families, several of my friends who are active duty in the Navy and the Air Force, and retired Air Force and retired Army and whatever, all kinds of different mix of people there to honor her. And it was a great way to send her off into the wild blue yonder.
So what was it that prompted you, after all of this was over, to decide to write a book about it?
So during this process, a lot of people, when they would hear about my story, would say, wow, this would make a really great book. And I'd be like, yeah, okay, it would. Kind of busy getting this law passed. So once it went through the Senate, I suddenly found myself with a lot more free time. And I was kind of at the house one day, and I was kind of organizing all this stuff that I had accumulated over time, like notes about meetings and newspaper articles and all this stuff. And I thought, oh, I can write a book. Like, I'm a lawyer. I write all day. That's my job. So, of course. And then, naively, she said. So over the summer, I started writing the first draft of this book. And obviously, I wanted the funeral to be like the ending of the book. So I wrote, until the funeral. And then when the funeral happened, I added, I continued and finished it with that. And then I talked to an editor who helped me kind of fix it all and put it in a good order that makes sense and get rid of stuff I didn't need. And like, it was super long. So, kind of get the really important parts out. And that took like another year. So, but yeah, basically people just kept telling me this would be a great book. When are you writing a book? And I'm like, I don't know. I've never written a book. And I thought it would be a good project. And it was a lot of work, and I don't know if I had realized how much work it was going to be if I would have done it. So it's kind of good I didn't really know what I was getting into. But it's interesting, when the book came out in February 2019, and we had the book launch at the Women's Military Memorial, where we had the funeral service, which was nice. It was really nice how supportive the aviation community and a lot of other people still were of the story and wanting to have, the book, and kind of like my grandmother wanting to be at Arlington because there's millions of visitors there who might see the WASP on the gravestone. I wrote a book because even though I go out and give talks now, like my grandma did, I can't talk to people all the time. And having a book out in the world is just a better way to have the story out there. Like, here's what happened. Here's the story. You know, if I don't come talk to your school or your air show, like, here's a way you can learn about what I did and what my family did and my perspective on the story. And obviously there are a lot of people involved, and they might have their own perspective or their own background that I'm not aware of, but this is kind of how I saw things and my perspective on the whole situation. And I use it to teach people about not just the history of the women Air Force service pilots and the importance of honoring, you know, what people have done, but I use it to explain to people, like, how do you actually make a change? You know, activism is very trendy right now. Like, people are upset about all these different things. They want to change things, but it's like, how do you actually go to the government or whatever, you know, bureaucracy you're dealing with and change what you're upset about or what you need to, what you want to things to look like, right? Like, if you want a new stop sign in your neighborhood, you're not going to go to the United States Congress, right? So I use it to teach young and adult people, like students and adults, you know, that may have their civics may have rusted, you know, or like kids that are learning about the structure of the United States government. It can be very abstract, right? So this is a good story to say, here's like a one-page bill, and this was the problem, and this is who we talked to, and this is exactly what happened. And then when it becomes a law, you know, it goes in the United States Code, and here's the sentences that you can read it. It's there now. And so I explain, like, this is how a law, you know, how a bill becomes a law. This is what happens.
Well, we have just a few minutes left here. We've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. So a couple of them go back to the history of the WASP program itself. And I don't believe there was, the question was, were the WASP training to do any kind of overseas operations, either flying, ferrying the aircraft or not? I don't recall that ever being mentioned, but I could be wrong.
The WASP program itself was domestic. They flew within the United States. But if you look into the earlier history of when they were thinking about the program, you can read about the air transport pilots in Britain, because that was a little bit of a model of what they were trying to do. And so some of them very early on, before the program kind of went over there to learn about it and study it. And, you know, so you can see some of it in there. But the program itself, once it was developed in the United States, the purpose was to do domestic flying duties, with the idea that it would free up male pilots to go overseas to fly combat missions, and the women were not intended to be going overseas to fly missions.
All right. When your grandmother talked at various school groups or things, did she ever talk about or encourage women or young ladies to consider going into space?
Yes, I actually, when I was a kid, was very interested in being an astronaut, and I went to space camp twice, and I read all kinds of things about space, and I read Jackie Cochran's autobiography and knew all about all the astronauts at the time. And she was very supportive of women, just aviation, aerospace, being astronauts, anything like that in that nature, in that field, very supportive.
Did she have any interesting flying stories that she related to you?
Well, like I said earlier, my grandmother was a tough nut to crack. She was very modest and kind of like, well, I just wanted to serve my country and fly planes. And it's like, yeah, but nobody else was doing this, you know. But she was very, you know, she really didn't share a lot of interesting stories with me, or she just thought what she did was very mundane and like interesting in the sense that she was there flying, but that the actual day-to-day stuff she was doing was just training men, and it wasn't anything really to brag about or anything. So unfortunately, I don't have any super interesting stories about her. The ones that I know about are her friends that had interesting stories. So
right.
I don't know if she was reluctant to tell me because she was my grandma. Maybe you don't want to tell your grandkids these stuff, or she just really didn't want to share. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because in talking with other WASP, the same thing comes up. It's like they don't have an interesting story, but they know someone who had an interesting story.
Yeah.
So I think if you could get them all together, they'd all tell wonderful stories about each other, and what
Yes.
a discussion that would be.
And I've talked to other family people too, and they say the same thing. Like grandma wouldn't tell me stuff, but then I hear from other people that my grandma told them stuff. Like, but she won't tell me stuff. So
Let's see. One of our viewers is saying your grandmother's story is very inspiring. Have you heard or met someone who decided to go into aviation because of her or sharing her experiences?
yes, in fact, since I have started this process, I just today was flipping through some old screenshots and like deleting stuff from my phone, and I came across this message from someone who I met in this process who was in the Air Force, but she was not a pilot at the time. And she wrote to me a couple years after that and said, because of you and your grandma's story, I'm now entering pilot training and I'm really excited. So I've definitely had plenty of people who said, I'm really inspired to hear about this. And it prompted me to, go to give me the courage to go out and try this. And so I've had, yes, many people tell me that like they've gotten into aviation or they've, tried to get a more difficult flight certificate or whatever, or a more challenging role in aviation because of this.
Good, good. Of course, the Commemorative Air Force has a program, the Rise Above WASP program, that was going to really have a full launch last year, but that kind of got postponed with everything that happened. But have you seen the movie that goes along with the program?
Yes, I have seen the Commemorative Air Force Rise Above WASP film, and it is wonderful. And I think it's great. It's not too long, explains the story. It has some really great aerial videography and interviews with some of the women Air Force service pilots who were still alive when they were filming it. Yes, I enjoyed a lot, and it's unfortunate that my grandmother is not here to be able to see that because I think she would have really appreciated such a thing to help teach people about what they did.
And again, that will be a traveling exhibit similar to the Tuskegee Airmen Rise Above that the CAF has. So it'll be traveling to air shows as things begin to open up and become more normal as it would be in 2021. For you, 2021 is also going to bring on another book.
Yes, I'm really excited to announce that I have a children's book coming out on the week of Veterans Day. Its official publication date is November 9th, and I'll be having the book launch at the National Aviation Hall of Fame on Veterans Day in Ohio. So I'm really excited. It was illustrated by my very talented cousin artist, Randall Harmon, another granddaughter of my grandma. So it was great to be able to have her do the beautiful illustrations for the story. And it's aimed at children basically ages like 4 to 8, kids, kind of learning to read, grandparents reading to their children, their grandkids, that kind of thing. The kid across the street really likes it, but apparently he really likes that my picture's on the book and he thinks it makes me famous. So that's kind of cute. But yeah, I'm really excited for this book to come out because it will help tell the story to a different audience. So I'm excited.
Good. And both books, What Grandma Did and Final Flight, Final Fight, are available on Amazon or through your website.
That is correct. Or you can ask your local bookseller to order it. Yeah, but it's on Amazon for pre-order, Barnes and Noble, anywhere, whatever you're interested in using, they should be able to find it.
Good. And just as before we sign off tonight, are there any other books that you would recommend if folks want to learn more about the WASP?
So Bee Haydu wrote a really great book called Letters Home. She and her mother communicated via letter while she was training with the WASP, and she recreates a lot of those letters and talks about her time in the WASP, and that's a really a wonderful book because it's actually written by a WASP to learn about their story. There's another great book called Women Who Flew for Their Country, which talks about the WASP. It also talks about the night witches, which is really fascinating. Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting books. Sarah Rickman has written, I think, almost 20 books about the WASP. And she has a lot that are about individual women who served with either the WASP or the earlier program, the Auxiliary Firing Squadron. And she has some that are for young readers. So, kids like in junior high school, which are great. Yeah, there's a lot of great books out there about their stories for all ages.
Including this one. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. It was, as they say, it's a page turner, but it really was. I enjoyed it from cover to cover. And if you have not read the book, please go out and buy it. It's available, like she said, through Amazon, through your local bookseller, or on Erin's website. And you can do the Kindle version and carry it with you wherever you go, and you'll be able to read the book quite quickly. It is one that I didn't want to put down. So thank you, Erin. Congratulations on that first book, and we'll look forward to the second one, the children's book, coming out in November.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Well, and to those of you joining us tonight, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be a part of our Warbird Tube Wednesday night webinar. If you have any suggestions or guests that you think we should try to track down and get on one of these upcoming webinars, please drop Leah Block a note at media@cafhq.org. And we'll be back next Wednesday night with another Warbird Tube webinar. We want to thank Erin Miller for being a part of our program tonight. And for the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have a great night.